Well, in your high school years, I was wondering what kind of activities you were involved in. I think you started mentioning earlier about the Young People's Christian Organization.
Yes, they had the Young People's Christian Organizations that, to extent, it may exist today, not to the same degree, but the Protestant churches throughout the Northwest would have a yearly, what they call the Young People's Christian Association, and I'm sure they did it at the Buddhist church. You would meet at different areas, whether Spokane or Portland, Seattle. We've had several in Wapato. And we would get together and have I'm sure that that kind of format hasn't changed a great deal. It's mainly so that the young people can get together. And it was a form of socialization as well as, religious activity. And it was, I think these activities within organization brought out the leadership among the Niseis. They took on certain kinds of responsibility and continued them that helped them, whatever organizations they participated in later. And the other form was the various athletic competitions, which including judo, kendo, and the baseball and basketball teams.
How about girls? What kind of sports did they play?
Nothing. It was a spectator sport, I think. I became knowledgeable about baseball because I kept score and sent it as a correspondent to I think it was in the North American Post. I was just reading out there where it was 100 years. And so it must have been the Post, and I would send that in. And later I was a scorekeeper, and I can still enjoy baseball because I know much more about it than it was my training of keeping score for the Wapato Nippons.
Wasn't there a girls' basketball league?
I think that we tried, but it never took off very well. There might have been. You may have read about it. And somehow it gets mixed up with my junior high school days, whether it was it a school activity or was it a Japanese activity? I can't remember. But I know I must not have been very good at it, or else had more memories of it.
What were some of your other school activities?
The school activities were somewhat limited because we took the bus in and out, and they didn't make way for after-school activities as the emphasis is now. And so I can't remember being that active in school activities. I remember being in a operetta. Of course, it was one of the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas in junior high school, but I don't remember being very active in school.
Was there, obviously you went to an integrated school.
Yes.
Did you have outside school contact with your non-Japanese American student friends?
Not that much. I think that our neighbors, by and large, were Caucasian, because, we were scattered, and so probably had more contact with our neighbors. And I had good relations with my schoolmates, but I don't think socially we participated very much, interaction. As teenagers, so we had a lot of dances among the Japanese, and although some of the parents frowned on it, I can remember getting the flatbed trucks together and having the phonograph and dancing at night in the moonlight, and those are kind of unique things that happened and were good memories. And in those days, you didn't have to worry about drinking. You didn't have to drink. Some might have smoked, but I don't recall anybody. And no drugs. And why the parents were so objected so much. I know that the parents who were broad-minded, who allowed their kids to dance, and others who frowned upon it. And I think there was some tension among the parents, but as far as the young people were concerned, it was just sort of a fun activity.
How did your parents feel about the
dances?
dances?
They were very open-minded.
So the Matsushita farm hosted these dances?
No, because we were, for one thing, we didn't have any brothers. And, I don't remember having great big trucks either. So we always had places that had big trucks and maybe electricity so that they could play the phonographs, and lighting sometimes, just hook up some light. But they were sort of unique activities that were just sort of identified. I don't know whether other groups around the Northwest, Japanese groups around the Northwest, ever did that. They were fun.
What kind of songs did you?
Well, you'll just have to go back, because, I can remember the ones that were more identified with evacuation days, going back to the White Christmas, the first Christmas in camp. But I'm sure if I heard them, I might know what they were.
What'd you wear? What did you wear for the dances?
We didn't wear pants. I'm sure we wore skirts. I can't. And then, of course, we graduated from on top of the flatbed truck dancing to having dances within at the Association Hall. Mm-hmm. Permitted that occasionally, and then they went to public dance halls. And we went to the Donald Dance Hall a lot after we were a little older, and live band. And not everybody would go, but we would go to those. And there you intermingle with the Caucasians, but you had your own groove.
Was there obviously you went to an integrated school?
Yes.
Did you have outside school contact with your non-Japanese American student friends?
Not that much. I think that our neighbors, by and large, were Caucasian, because we were scattered, and so probably had more contact with our neighbors, and I had good relations with my schoolmates, but I don't think socially we participated very much, interaction. As teenagers, so we had a lot of dances among the Japanese, and although some of the parents frowned on it, I can remember getting the flatbed trucks together and having the phonograph and dancing at night in the moonlight, And those are kind of unique things that happened and were good memories. And in those days, you didn't have to worry about drinking. You didn't have to drink. Some might have smoked, but I don't recall anybody. And no drugs. And why the parents were so objected so much. I know that the parents who were broad-minded, who allowed their kids to dance, and others who frowned upon it. And I think there was some tension among the parents, but as far as the young people were concerned, it was just sort of a fun activity.
How did your parents feel about the dances?
They were very open-minded.
So the Matsushita farm hosted these dances?
No, because we were... for one thing, we didn't have any brothers, and I don't remember having great big trucks either. So we always had places that had big trucks and maybe electricity so that they could play the phonographs, and lighting sometimes, just hook up some light. But they were sort of unique activities that were just. Sort of identified. I don't know whether other groups around the Northwest, Japanese groups around the Northwest, ever did that. They were fun.
What kind of songs did you?
Well, you'll just have to go back, 'cause, I can remember the ones that were more identified with evacuation days, going back to the White Christmas, the first Christmas in camp. But I'm sure if I heard them, I might know what they were.
What'd you wear? What did you wear for the dances?
We didn't wear pants. I'm sure we wore skirts. I can't. And then, of course, we graduated from on top of the flatbed truck dancing to having dances within at the association hall. Mm-hmm. Permitted that occasionally, and then they went to public dance halls. And we went to the Donald Dance Hall a lot after we were a little older, and live band. And not everybody would go, but we would go to those. And there you intermingle with the Caucasians, but you had your own group.
Well, I was wondering in high school, what might a typical weekday have looked like for you? You get up in the morning and
catch the bus, and you make it. Probably we made our lunches because they didn't have school lunches, and many at that time. I remember when the school lunches were introduced when I was in high school, and they brought in soup made in a tub. I can remember that. And that was the first step, but we made our lunch, and then we went to school and participated in whatever activities, and got on the bus and came back, and that was mainly. And sometimes if there were Japanese schoolmates who participated in some of the activities, athletic activities, we might attend a game or something like that. But and then in our one-room schoolhouse, I remember in Guyette in the summertime, we would lift the window and crawl up and get into their library and take them out and crawl back out of the window and for reading. And I was telling a friend who is a judge, and I said, "Oh, I suppose that's breaking and entering." And she says, "Oh, well." But in those days, it was quite innocent,
I was wondering, when you were still in high school, were you involved in the Japanese-American Citizens League at that time, or was that later?
I think they began the Japanese-American Citizens League, and it was semi-active, but just prior to evacuation in those days, but it was never an active organization, and probably more people from the Yakima were more involved in that, although there was an organization. There were a lot of organizations, such as, especially among the Kondo and the Judo, and they had their lessons, and
oh, did you say there was a girls' club, also a Wapato Girls' Club? Mm-hmm. Was that something that you were involved in?
I was too young. My older sister was involved. And, they had Odori. Excuse me. But they had Fukudas. Excuse me.
For people who don't know what Odori is, could you say a little bit about
Odori,
that?
well, it's Japanese, it's a classical Japanese dance, mostly. And it's very stylized. And they have, since I didn't take it, my younger sister took the Odori. And it's sort of a disciplined dance where you wear the kimono and with the tabi, and you learn classical dancing. And they had Mr. Fukuda, who was the coach, who was also the tennis coach and the baseball coach, also taught Japanese dance, Odori. And there are quite a few who took Odori from him. So, and they would have their recitals, of course. But it was in conjunction with, very often with language school productions, maybe once or twice a year, and to which the general public was invited.
Did very many of the white Caucasian population come to these events?
Yes, they did. They did come.
What kind of reaction would they give?
Well, I don't think they. I think they came because they were interested, and I think that it doesn't differ from any kind of reaction if you went to something that's a little different cultural activity. And some were probably supporters, others were curious, and others were happy that we had a diverse culture, and others really didn't care, you know. The community was integrated in that, except for certain periods of time and certain people, you felt the sting of waves of discrimination, of violence occasionally. But generally, people accepted you, but they didn't really champion you as toward integration, because in theaters you were segregated. I'd always go upstairs, and these little subtle kinds of discrimination existed even when we were evacuated, I believe. So,
well, I was wondering in high school, what might a typical weekday have looked like for you? You get up in the morning and
catch the bus. And you make it. Probably we made our lunches because they didn't have school lunches and many at that time. I remember when the school lunches were introduced when I was in high school, and they brought in soup made in a tub. I can remember that. And that was the first step. But we made our lunch, and then we went to school and participated in whatever activities, and got on the bus and came back. And that was mainly, and sometimes if there were Japanese schoolmates who participated in some of the activities, athletic activities, we might attend a game or something like that. But and then in our one-room schoolhouse, I remember in Guyette in the summertime, we would lift the window and crawl up and get into their library and take them out and crawl back out of the window and for reading. And I was telling a friend who is a judge, and I said, "Oh, I suppose that's breaking and entering." And she says, "Oh, well." But in those days, it was quite innocent, you know.
I was wondering, when you were still in high school, were you involved in the Japanese-American Citizens League at that time, or was that later?
I think they began the Japanese-American Citizens League, and it was semi-active, but just prior to evacuation in those days, but it was never an active organization, and probably more people from the Yakima were more involved in that, although there was an organization. There were a lot of organizations, such as, especially among the Kondo and the Judo, and they had their lessons.
Oh, did you say there was a girls' club, also a Wapato Girls' Club? Mm-hmm. Was that something that you were involved in?
I was too young. My older sister was involved. They had Odori, excuse me, but they had the Fukudas, excuse me.
For people who don't know what Odori is, could you say a little bit about
Odori,
that?
well, it's Japanese, it's a classical Japanese dance, mostly. And it's very stylized, and they have. Since I didn't take it, my younger sister took the Odori, and it's sort of a disciplined dance where you wear the kimono and with the tabi, and you learn classical dancing. And they had Mr. Fukuda, who was the coach, who was also the tennis coach and the baseball coach, also taught Japanese dance, Odori. And there are quite a few who took Odori from him. And they would have their recitals, of course. But it was in conjunction very often with language school productions, maybe once or twice a year, and to which the general public was invited.
Did very many of the white Caucasian population come to these events?
Yes, they did. They did come.
What kind of reaction would they give?
Well, I don't think they. I think they came because they were interested, and I think it doesn't differ from any kind of reaction if you went to something that's a little different cultural activity. And some were probably supporters, others were curious, and others were happy that we had a diverse culture, and others really didn't care, you know. The community was integrated in that, except for certain periods of time and certain people, you felt the sting of waves of discrimination, of violence occasionally. But generally, people accepted you, but they didn't really champion you toward integration, because in theaters you were segregated. I'd always go upstairs, and these little subtle kinds of discrimination existed even when we were evacuated, I believe. So,
well, you just mentioned the violence, and I was wondering if you would just tell us about that time in 1933 when violence was directed against.
The violence was really directed against the Filipino farm workers, and at that time there was a number of Filipino young men who I can't remember whether the women were allowed in or not, whether they were under quota, but there were the population of the Filipino young men who were farm workers. Many of them worked, I think they either went to the cannery in the summertime and came back in time to harvest, or they stayed on the Japanese farms, and it was they targeted the Japanese farmers that had hired Filipinos, and it was really directed toward them, although, you know, I'm sure that they're willing to bomb a Japanese farm as well as anybody else. And there were about 5, I think, or 4 or 5 bombings mainly of greenhouses or some structure that was on, not the residences normally, but generally some structures that were on the farms, and they were not devastating bombing, but enough to do some damage, and of course to frighten people. And ours happened when our front porch was set on fire, and I remember my father getting out and stamping it out he was already in bed, and taking off his night clothes and stamping out the fire. But and we had a Filipino farm worker living with in our mobile home, and he realized that who it was directed to, and I can remember he went to tell him that everything was okay, and he had his knife out, sharpening his knife, and it just really brought it really sort of frightened us then, but. They did catch many of the arsonists later, and and it's usually the names that we were aware of that were anti-Filipino, anti-Japanese people.
It must have been really scary.
Yes, it was. It was scary, but what can you do? You know, you hope that those who were enforcing the law would do so, but I don't think that any of us were knowledgeable enough to really pursue it, to demand some sort of extra protection or care. But by that time, I do believe that the law enforcement became aware that it could get out of hand, and then I'm sure it would be interesting to look at this through the eyes of those who were directly affected, the Filipino farmers, or Filipino young men who were the subject of the bombing and of the terrors. We would call the terrorist acts. But I think most people, minorities who experience this kind of what we consider violence or terror now, have to live through it gradually over the years. I think the first one was in 1907, I believe it was. And and to different degrees of what happened. You live with it. You live with it, and you don't like it. You barely tolerate it, but you have to wonder what else can be done, and they prefer to stay and raise their families, make a living, and whatever.
Did your father talk to you about this, though? Must have been quite frightening for you all, and
I think that we probably were just, by that time, most of us were old enough to realize the seriousness. And we were made more acutely aware of the possibilities of more violence. But I don't think our parents probably were as frightened as we were, and probably we had to try to assure them as things occurred in ensuing years leading toward evacuation.
How about your classmates? It was, did they say anything to you?
I can't remember that they did. If they did, I don't think they would talk about it as young people. I doubt it very much.
Did your father continue to hire
Filipino
workers?
He stayed on. I remember Pete stayed on, and I imagine he was quite frightened too, though, because I'm sure he realized it was really directed to him, and I'm sure he felt bad that it was the house that was fired upon, and and I'm sure these, as it turned out, they were teenagers, probably older teens or teenagers who did this.
When some of these arsonists were caught and convicted, were you surprised that anyone was actually?
Yes, I think we were. Some of them we knew that the word gets around who were the instigators. Some of them we knew. Others we were surprised, and some of the families have become upright citizens. As the years go on, I think then the kids grew up, and I don't know whether they got into further trouble or not, but some of them turned out to be good citizens, and others, I think, probably not. We didn't follow their careers or anything.
Well, that incident in 1933, you were, I guess, a junior in high school, and then the following year you were a senior, at a time when most kids in high school, you're starting to think about your future, and I'm wondering, what were some of your hopes and dreams at that time?
I think that, the Japanese families instilled the value of education, of continuing on, and I'm sure that we felt that it would be nice if we could continue on to higher education. And but it was during the Depression years too, and I don't remember whether I said that it was a philosophy of our parents that we should leave home to grow up. And my older sister went to Seattle and stayed with a Japanese family and worked at the Furia store. She worked there and for several years, and she met the man she married at the store and eventually lived in Seattle. But I wanted to I was very interested in design, and I had the opportunity of going to a design school in Seattle. And I think that I had the opportunity of working as a nursemaid, a babysitter, to a Japanese family who, he was identified with some Japanese bank, I believe, but they had 4 children. The youngest was about a 7-month-old baby, and I was the nursemaid and took almost full charge of the children because they had a housekeeper and a cook who was also Japanese. And while I was there, that was my job of taking care of the youngsters, and I think I was not very old myself, and I really kind of enjoyed that. And they taught me how to ride a bicycle, and I remember falling into the rose bed and things like that. But while I was there, I went to I had friends at the Blaine, what is the Blaine Memorial Church? I went to the church, the Methodist Church in Seattle, and got to know people. And then I think I heard about this design school in downtown Seattle, and I applied and switched. And I went home during the summer and came back and stayed with the proprietor of the design school and stayed with them for about a year, and working for my room and board. But then I went back during the summer we would always return to help on the farm. But it was my mother's philosophy, and that we should get out in the world and not depend on parents, and to support them all the time, and to get to know other conditions.
Well, does anything kind of stand out in your mind from that time in Seattle? I mean, here you were, kind of your first time really away from your folks, and
I remember that we had young men from Seattle who would come and work on the farms at summertime, and they would say, "You better be careful what group you pick your friends." And so I don't know what they thought, but and we had friends who were at the university too, and so I attended a lot of the social activities of the people who were already at the university, and some of them I knew, and some of them I met after being here, and I was pretty safe staying with the church group, and I don't think I ever really got into something that of great concern, and I had a great social life, get to know the Seattle people.
Were you dating at that time, going out with fellows? Or?
At that time, I wasn't that much. I did date just in a kind of friendly way, and while I was in Seattle, I dated with someone who was going to the university who was from the east side, and that I knew before, and with different people from Spokane, some of the students from Spokane, and not generally dating anybody, although when I went home, I began to go out with the man I married, who was also from the Valley and who was going to Washington State University, which is a issue. But generally, we experienced what at that time were Nisei social activities.
What kind of design school? Was that clothing design?
It was clothing and grafting design, and I was really interested in, it was a school here from the Charette School of Design from Los Angeles, and I had a lot of drafting, and so, but, it certainly was, the evacuation ended that.
Well, let's see, I guess there were a couple of years in between there where you moved back, before World War II started, you moved back to
Yes, I'm back to and at that time, I think I stayed with my parents and worked for a while at the groceries, the fruit grocery store in the winter there. And I think it was during that time when 1941, and why I stayed there instead of coming back to Seattle, it's not that clear for me. But when Pearl Harbor happened, it was and I can remember, that changed everything.
Can you recall that day for us, what you were doing and how you found out?
We had gone to church that day, and whether we heard it at church or whether I'm sure we heard it at church. And when I remember coming home and telling my father, who had not heard about it, and he was just shocked. And then, from there on, it was a different climate because you were so unsure of what would be happening, and events happened very quickly. The various orders came down, and for a long time, because we were located 150 miles or so from Seattle and the Pacific. The ocean, that we thought that there would not be, we would not have to be evacuated. And some of the families from Seattle who had businesses relocated their business to Yakima, thinking it would be fun. My older sister and husband came back and to live with us because they realized that Seattle would be evacuated. And but the orders came quite late, and but the farmers were told to continue farming, as if they were not going to be evacuated. Although we knew we were going to be evacuated, and they did. They kept up their farms and tended their crops as if they would not be leaving. Meanwhile, going through the process of making arrangements for their possessions or their leases or their farms, depending on what business they were in.
Did you have any premonition that something might happen? Were you aware of
I think that we did. I did, because the orders came, establishing boundaries. But we weren't aware, and we were aware that there was some activity going on in the Hanford area, and probably that triggered the move. Except that the boundary was the Columbia River, and those who lived on the east side of Columbia and those who lived on the other side. There was a boundary, but it took from the Canadian border to Columbia River on the south side, and that area left in June, and they were entrained in June.
Well, before we get to that point, I wanted to back up a little bit, because it would have been about March or so that, the end of March, that the Bainbridge Islanders actually were moved out.
Yes, early in February.
So when you heard that, at that time, the farmers in the Yakima Valley were still being urged to continue on with all your crops and everything.
Yes.
What would you have been doing in March and April?
Well, there would be March and April would be planting and cultivating, planting, and tending. By the time in June, your crops are up. And, well, we were aware that the Farm Home Administration, I guess, sent out notices to, would be nationwide, or especially around the Colorado area, Colorado, Oklahoma, those areas, to take over these farms, and they were paid to do that. And then you were aware after the orders came that people from out of state licenses would drive by and come and look at your property and drive on, and so you are very much aware of our eventual moving, but law-abiding as we were, we continued to keep up with the farms.
Well, how did life change after December 7th?
Oh, of course, you had the curfew. The Nisei leaders were picked up, and so that really crippled as far as the Nisei leadership was concerned. And by that time, there were some violence or terrorist activities. The Japanese Association building was burned, and other attempts were made to set fire on some other places. So that we were made aware, very much aware, that there was a great deal of hostility, but we were so busy trying to take care of our own business of what to take, what to store, what to sell, what to throw out, and eventually what to do with what you have.
Did you throw out things? I know that some people felt very scared about having anything Japanese or that tied them to Japan.
Yes, I remember we didn't have very many firearms, anything like that, but my father burying his Japanese books. I still have some that we got later that is molded yet. But I think most of them were contraband, so-called contrabands but orders came about curfew. Orders came later about restricting your mileage or how. And they came gradually, so before you knew it, you were living under a great deal of orders. And meanwhile, you had to do something about what to keep, what to store, what to throw out, and you had to contend with people who came to pick up things so cheaply and.
Well, you were the oldest
yes, I was.
child at home because your sister was married.
My sister was married, but I remember just doing things so my parents would not become very frightened, and I would cry every night, after everybody was in bed, and think, oh my gosh, what's happening to us? Why are they doing this to us? And it really was not so much frightening, but a very distressing time. Distressing. You got so you didn't know who to trust and who to depend on. The neighbors who were your friends, you weren't quite sure. Others who weren't quite sure turned out to be very, very loyal, but were afraid to speak up. We helped the Wapato townspeople in the registration, and could hear them say, when are they going to leave? We'll sure be glad when they get out of there. And having to listen to people like that who were so-called upright citizens of and officials in the town. And so those who were older and had to do a little more assist in things in registering and working with those who evacuated us. I don't know about others, but you got to the place where you're very, very skeptical and about relationships with other people, because you didn't really blame your neighbors or people who would not speak up in your behalf, and you really appreciated the few who did. But
tell me more. Why do you say that you wouldn't blame those who didn't speak up?
Well, those who would speak up for the Japanese would be very unpopular. They would have to face the consequences even after we were gone. You see, it's the same kind of attitude you have during the Civil Rights Movement. You were sympathetic to the African Americans. I'm sure that it would be magnified in some ways, so that you really got so you didn't quite trust people unless they somehow knew. And because the people you had some respected before and were town leaders, they turned out that they were not. They were just as hostile and probably in more polite ways. But so it was very hard to really trust people until you get to know them very thoroughly after that experience.
Well, because here you and your family had grown up in Wapato your entire life. Your folks had been there from the early 1900s. And this
Sure.
this is 40 years later.
Yeah, but you see, periods of prejudice or discrimination erupted from time to time over this. So the discrimination and prejudice is very deep-seated, and I think it depends on how it affects you personally. And I think that all of us are capable of experiencing that. You might have hostility to somebody else, and I think we can only point to the Civil Rights Movement, we can point to the Vietnam days, we can point to what's happening to the Hispanics in my area at the present time, the immigrants, Hispanic illegals they're called, or what happened to the Filipinos before us, after us, or the Chinese before us. And it's inherent in our culture, I think, and how we view Muslims at the present time. And I think all of us have to ask ourselves, are we entirely free of that kind of feeling ourselves? And I can understand that, but you don't condone it, of course.
We're continuing our interview with Kara Kondo, and right before our break, we had been talking about how life changed after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. And you had also told us some about how you could understand that some of the white community members would be fearful of standing up on behalf of the Japanese Americans, and yet some did.
Yes, we had especially two people, prominent members of the community. One was the proprietor of the hardware store in Wapato, Esther Boyd, who testified at the Tolan committee, as well as Dan McDonald, who was an orchardist in Donald, and that's rural, about 2 miles north of Wapato, who also testified and at the Tolan committee. And it was not a request made by the Japanese community, but from their own conscience. And both helped the community by either storing some valuables or being trustees of some of the property. Both Mr. McDonald was a trustee of the Buddhist church and kept some of their Buddhist church altar pieces in his care. And Esther Boyd served in many other ways. Esther Boyd especially suffered the wrath or the those people who failed to understand and boycotted her hardware store, and probably she suffered other indignities because of her support for the Japanese community. But we were ever grateful for their support. Excuse me. Cut this for a while. Wapato, I think all areas where the Japanese were experienced frightening. It was a frightening experience to return to that area. It was in Wapato where every business in Wapato had no Japs wanted signs, and there was a distinct feeling of hostility and among most of the people, and some those who came to test the area of thinking of coming back. If they stopped and talked to some of the business people, were encouraged to go on, move on. It was a time when the Methodist Church was occupied by a family who refused to move. Miss Pete, Azalea Pete, who was a missionary and had worked among the Eastern Oregon residents who were from former Yakima Valleyites, came back there to open up the church as a hostel, and had to take very strong measures to have the residents move. And the same way, as far as the Buddhist Kaikon that became a hostel, I remember the first Christmas, people were those who had returned sat around discussing what would happen, whether they would remain in the area or to move on someplace. And it was more frightening than, I believe, when we left. The feeling was very, very hostile, and everyone felt unwelcomed. It gradually changed, however, and through the years, it took a while. But at that time, those who might have had good business relationship with townspeople could no longer feel that kind of trust. And it gradually has returned to normalcy, but I think that the war itself has took toll in many, many ways.
Do you have a personal story of maybe one of these relationships that...
You hear, and somehow, you don't really listen, but there were a number of them where they would stop by at the newspaper office, and perhaps just to say hello, and they would be asked whether they were going to plan to stay, relocate in Wapato, and were encouraged to move on. They would not be welcome. People that you considered were your friends in the past. And certainly, as you go into businesses with no Japs wanted signs there, you certainly did not feel welcome at all. And the things changed, I think, as people begin to settle there, but only a very small percentage of people who returned to Yakima Valley, and for Yakima residents, there were just only one or two families that returned to Yakima, and only very few families that returned to Toppenish. Those who had relocated from the camps into eastern Washington, or even to Moses Lake, or parts of Idaho, or to California, or had jobs in the Midwest or on the East Coast, or who had attended schools, elected not to return to the Valley.
But how about personal stories of after December 7th?
Excuse me?
Back in 1941. Do you have personal stories yourself of how neighbors or friends?
Oh, we had
anything outstanding?
We had a Finnish neighbor, I remember, who stored some of the things that we didn't quite trust to the government storage. Who kept our things? Who would not speak up, but was adamantly for her neighbors, perhaps because we were neighbors and we had known her for over the years. And neighbors who would not speak up, but privately would come to us and support us. But by and large, I think it was sort of a hands-off by the community itself. And as a result, the Japanese population had changed from the families that lived in the Yakima Valley to a very small percentage. Those who had owned their farms, their families returned and resettled. My parents-in-law came back and were there the time that my husband was discharged from service, and they were settled in their farm. But for those who leased property, very few people returned to the area.
What did your family take? You said that you stored some things with your Finnish neighbors. What were you able to take to the camps?
Well, of course, things, as you know, you can only take what you could carry, and that really meant one or two items, and it varied. I had bought a new portable sewing machine, and I carried that heavy thing all over, but along with perhaps something else I could carry, and it differed with. Teenagers wanted to take their mitts and someone said they wanted to take their bat, but they wouldn't let them take the bat. But they could take their mitts and the balls, and they took their scrapbooks. That meant a lot to them. Or of course, you have to take clothing and bedding with you.
How about your mother?
I can't even remember what she took, but I think it was probably clothing for all of us, what she could carry. And when you were able to store in a government storage that was provided by the relocation authority, that said they would be eventually shipped to when you were relocated into a little more permanent quarter rather than the evacuation centers. And we received several boxfuls of, I can't even remember how it came, but certainly it helped to make our one-room apartments more livable.
Do you remember that you wrote a letter that was published in the newspaper?
Oh, I've written so many letters too, so I don't know which one. But
when you were being evacuated,
I know you refer to that, but I don't remember. Actually, I don't even remember that. I couldn't even tell you what I said.
I'll tell you later. What did your parents, did they discuss this with you? What were
Not
their feelings?
too much, because I had the responsibility of seeing that they were as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. And I think you could see the change in responsibility at that time. It was a new experience for them, of course, and as it was for me. But they were willing to go along with the regulations and went along without complaint, which is.
Well, now in 1942, in the spring, when you were being so-called evacuated, your father would have been in his 60s already.
Yes.
And your mother in her 50s.
Yes.
And you were about 26 or so.
Yes.
And so when you talk about the shifting of responsibility, here your father had been the head of the family and run his farm and so forth, and now it was coming into a situation where you were really handling most of the affairs for the family.
It was really baffling of course it was on unusual circumstances, and it dealt with legal documents and orders that came almost daily, and activities that was hard to understand. I think.
What did end up happening with all the crops that you had put in? And
well, eventually a young couple bought the lease, so-called lease, and they moved in after we moved out. But they had made arrangements. I don't know what kind of arrangements they had made with the government or with the agency that was handling that. I gather that to many of them, they were able to get it for free, probably.
Did you have any bank accounts at all? Or?
Oh, the bank accounts we were able to keep. And I look over the list. I still have them. I didn't bring them, of the little items that we sold. And 10 cents, 15 cents, and 25 cents, and we threw out so many things. I keep thinking of the headboards of what would be on antiques now, hardwood headboards that we had to take to the dump and things like that, or give them away. But selling them, everybody knew that you could just really get things cheaply from those who were going to be evacuated.
Did you have any pets?
I think we had a dog, and whether the dog was still alive, I don't. I think that the people who took over our property kept their pets. We had chickens too, but I don't. Well, they must have taken those too. It was time when people raised their own chickens and had pets.